Okay, it's recording now. Awesome. Now let's go to the presentation once again.
Once again.
There he is.
That is so satisfying.
Welcome everybody again. Well, to the third time that you are not seeing. You're only seeing this time. To another episode of Messianic Bible Study. Now today we're doing something slightly different. Michael here is joining us again. I have the honor of this presence. But today we're doing something slightly different. We are going to be talking about Christmas and whether or not it is pagan. Before I do anything, before I get into the presentation, I want to ask one question. And this is something that I just hope that we focus on as we study any sort of topic like this, but particularly as we study it now. The question is, if you are obstinate about Christmas, maybe you should reflect on whether or not it's an idol. And I mean this not just going one direction. I think if you're obstinate about celebrating Christmas and it turns out that it's actually wrong to do, like all the evidence points to it being something that God actually would not want us to do, then you just don't care about that, then maybe the question that you should ask is, are you giving everything to the Lord, or is Christmas an idol? On the other hand, the same question in reverse can be asked. If you are a Messianic, or a lot of evangelicals think this too, and all the evidence is pointing to it's perfectly all right to celebrate Christmas, but you're just like, nope, I think it's pagan, and I don't care what the evidence says, it's pagan, then are you also making it an idol? And I want you just to reflect on that as we do this quick overview of the literature on this topic, so that we can just give everything to the Lord, so we can be unified as the body of Christ, and so that we can just be more holy. And that's what I want for us. Okay, and of course, Michael, you can jump in whenever you want.
Yeah, I will. I just don't want to right now.
Okay, so let me get a drink of water. Starting trends. So, regarding the theory of the pagan origins of Christmas, this was begun by Alexander Hislop in the 1800s, and it has to do with these 5 topics that we're going to be going over. Nimrod plays an important role. Tammuz plays an important role as well. Osiris, Zeus, and Natalis Invictus, which is a Roman holiday. Now, if you think, how are those things connected? Nimrod was like back in Abraham's time. Tammuz, Osiris, and Zeus, they're 3 different gods from 3 different cultures that are like thousands of miles apart. And Natalis Invictus, well, that's like in Jesus' time, or even later. Well, we're going to get into that. Let's take a look at this timeline really quick. It's pretty awesome. Okay, moving on. So,
let's appreciate my work that I've done.
Alexander Hislop wrote a book in 1853 called The Two Babylons. And in this work, he gave a sort of, you could say, a synopsis of what he thinks the pagan influence of not only Christmas, but also the Catholic Church are. And in the work, The Two Babylons, he actually describes how there was this mystery cult in Babylon, and how this moved through history all the way forward to the Roman era, where Christians took up, or specifically Roman Catholics, took up a lot of these mystery cult ideas and just adopted them and then they became Christian ideas, quote unquote. And the way that he describes this in terms of Christmas is he talks about Nimrod. Like, it all starts with Nimrod, who was the founder of Babylon in the Bible. So Nimrod had a wife. His wife was Semiramis, who was a real person. Now, in Alexander Hislop's version, Nimrod has a son with Semiramis, and then the son dies, and then the son, Semiramis. I'm skipping a part. So Nimrod dies, and Semiramis is left to not be the queen anymore, but she doesn't like that. She wants to be the queen. So she marries her son, who is now the king. And so what happens then is the son dies, and she takes the son and deifies him so that she can maintain power, because she says, oh, he didn't die. He actually he's in heaven now, and I'm still the queen. So she can maintain this power. And what Alexander Hislop claims is that the son, what Semiramis claimed, was the son was born on December 25th. And the son was deified as Tammuz. And so what happens next, according to Alexander Hislop, is that this sort of tripartite view of Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz become somewhat of a godhead. You have like the father and the mother of heaven, and they have a son, and this son is Tammuz. But it gets translated into the distinction between Tammuz and Ishtar. So Semiramis becomes Ishtar in Babylon, and then this somehow evolves into or assimilates into the Egyptian cult as Osiris, Isis, and Horus. So you get this continuation of this ideology. And then, of course, because Egypt and the Greeks had some sort of trading when they were early on in their kingdoms, Osiris and Isis and Horus became Zeus and Diana, and one of Zeus's children. Eventually, this evolved into Mithraism, which then evolved into Saturnalia, and we see evidence of God's hatred of this cult, this specific mystery Babylonian cult, in things like the weeping for Tammuz, where in Jeremiah he talks about these women who are baking cakes for Tammuz and weeping for him. And this is described, or at least it originates in the story, The Descent of Ishtar. And it's this story where Ishtar, she, for some reason, wants to go down into hell and visit her sister, Ereshkigal. And Ereshkigal is like, well, you don't have special privileges. You can't leave here anymore because this is a prison. And then Ishtar says, I want to leave though. And then Ereshkigal says, well, you have to find a substitute. And so Ishtar goes up, or she sends a servant up, and she finds Tammuz, who is not mourning for her because she technically is dead. And he's like, well, I'm not mourning because she was a prostitute. And she gets mad and sends Tammuz down in her place. And then, of course, women really don't like that, according to this story. And so they weep for Tammuz, and there's this cycle of in the year of weeping for Tammuz. And the way that the story goes is because Tammuz was born on December 25th, according to Alexander Hislop, then this descent actually happens on December 25th, where he is sent back into the grave, and you have this weeping for Tammuz, and then there's this hope of a resurrection of Tammuz after the winter solstice.
Yeah, and just the only thing I would add is, as far as I am aware, the majority of scholars today reject Alexander Hislop as basically sloppy scholarship, and that most of his contemporaries at the time as well rejected him. I think one thing that would be important to note is they had sort of less historical documentation than we do today, but even with the lack of historical documentation we have today, he makes a lot of assumptions and leaps in logic in his book.
So the idea then that Alexander Hislop talks about is the Catholic Church at around the time of Constantine, or maybe before that, maybe slightly after that, they took these pagan festivals and they just liked it. Like, partly they just liked it, and partly the culture around them were celebrating them, and so the Catholic Church wanted to appeal to the culture, and so they took these pagan festivals and adopted them and just gave them Christian names. And so Nimrod became God the Father. Ishtar became the Holy Spirit, and Tammuz became Jesus. And so today you'll hear some Messianics, some Christians even, saying that when you celebrate the Christmas tree, or when you celebrate Christmas in general, then you're actually celebrating Tammuz, you're not celebrating Jesus. And ergo, Christians celebrate Nimrod and Tammuz and Ishtar. So that's the claim. And that's what we're going to be exploring today. So the first thing that we're going to look at is Nimrod. There are actually two theories about the origins of Nimrod in the Bible, because he's not attested to in any of the historical literature. If you look at Nimrod in Genesis 10, there are a few points about him. First, he was a son of Cush. Second, he was a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter. And the beginning of his kingdom is Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And he built many cities. In fact, he even went as far as Nineveh and built Nineveh. Now, because he's not attested to in like the historical literature, we actually try to, the scholars today, they really try to figure out why the Bible writes about him. Like, what is he, or where is he? And so there are two theories. There is the human origin of Nimrod, meaning that there was some person or some group of people or some conglomerate of multiple heroes in the early Sumerian period that the Bible just sort of meshes together and says, like, just in broad strokes, this is the history of Sumer and Babylon and Akkad and all of those. And we're just going to simplify that into a single person. If you want to learn more, go read the histories. That's like basically the idea of what the Bible's saying, according to some scholars. Some scholars think that Nimrod was a demythification of certain gods. And so they will look for gods who might have particular characteristics with Nimrod, because a lot of the Genesis story is God saying, you know, this God, he's actually not a god, for instance. And so perhaps Nimrod is one of these examples. God is saying, you know, these Babylonian gods, these Sumerian, these Assyrian gods, they're actually not a god. They were just a person, if that. So when you look at the human origins, there are actually two people who really stand out. So a lot of scholars, they like a bunch of other different possible explanations, this one king that is, what's his name? Tiglath-Ninurta, I believe. But he's from like the 13th century, and I don't really like that theory. So I like the theories that date him to an earlier time. Nimrod itself, the word most likely just means to rebel, and so you don't actually need to look for the word Nimrod in the histories. So you might look at, let's say, Sargon of Akkad, who was basically the first person to really encapsulate a lot of the Nimrod story. He was born a Semite, for instance, which is different because Nimrod was born of Cush. but Sargon was raised in Kish. So maybe there's some similarity. Different places, but he became a Babylonian cupbearer, and then he rebelled against his king and killed him and took over. And he began a campaign to unite Babel, Uruk, Akkad, and the rest of Shinar. And so you see a lot of these similarities here in the myth of Sargon and the myth of Nimrod. But you might also have Gilgamesh. And so Sargon was around 2400 BC. Gilgamesh was around 2500 BC. And you might think, well, Gilgamesh was just some mythical, like legendary creature or from this epic poem. But he is actually attested. His name is attested to in the histories. And so he just, wasn't, like, the myths come way later. So Gilgamesh was born in Akkad, 2500-ish. He was the first empire builder. He was the first person to create some sort of confederacy of a bunch of little city-states in order to attack other confederacies and stuff. And he was a mighty hunter. So we know those things. And so there's a possibility that Nimrod was a conglomerate of multiple legendary figures in those days. That's the human origin. Next, we're going to talk about Semiramis. Now, Semiramis was a real person, and most scholars associate her with Samu Ramat, who was an Assyrian queen. But we're going to talk about the ancient origins of Semiramis first, and how she sort of evolved. And we're going to talk about Walter Raleigh, we're going to talk about Eusebius, the king lists, and then what most scholars think. First, let's talk about what Eusebius describes her as. Now, Eusebius's chronicles, he doesn't really say a whole lot of his own stuff. He just puts together a bunch of other chroniclers and says, I think this guy's right. And so we have these 8 chroniclers all describing Semiramis in different ways. First, Josephus said she was unremarkable. He actually says that, according to Eusebius, Josephus says that Semiramis is a lot of hype, but if you actually read what happened, she's not really that great. She's just an unremarkable person. And the same with Abidenus. Both of them said, according to Eusebius, that Semiramis is just kind of, she was a queen, that's it. Castor, who was a little after Josephus, says that she reigned 42 years. However, her son, Ninus, and here's another thing, Semiramis is, according to Eusebius, her husband was Ninus, her son was Ninus. So her son Ninus was unremarkable. Now that's actually important because if Ninus married his mother, you would expect that to be some sort of remarkable thing. Someone might have made a remark about that. But Castor does not. He just says that she reigned for 42 years. Next, Diodorus says that she reigned for 42 years, and he dates her at about 2500 BC. Kephalion, 42 years, adds a little more detail, says that she kills most of her sons, but then one of her sons, Ninus, killed her, sort of to save his own life, and then begins to reign. And he says that this happened around 2700 BC. The king list that Eusebius has says that she reigned for 42 years, and this dates her at about 1700 BC. The Septuagint says that she reigned for 42 years and dates her to about 1400 BC. And then the Greek chronology says that she reigned, doesn't give much detail beyond that, and just says that she reigned for at around 1700 BC. So that's one of the earliest. Well, Eusebius, of course, is just bringing all these chroniclers together, and a lot of these people date from like 100 or so BC. Some of them date a couple hundred years after Christ. And so this gives a pretty good range of what, like, the first century, plus or minus a century, what the myth around Semiramis was. Next, let's jump forward to 1736 with Walter Raleigh's History of the World in 5 books. which was completed in 1736, was published posthumously in this volume that I read in 1736, but Raleigh actually wrote in 1650 something. So, Raleigh says that Semiramis was a conqueror around 2400 BC. It's kind of hard to tell because when you read his work, he gives a bunch of dates, but I couldn't find the one dates that I needed in order to date Semiramis precisely. But he says that she was around 2200 years after the beginning of the world, and it was a couple hundred years after the flood. So if you date the flood to approximately 2700 BC, you could get 2400 BC. So that's how I came up with that number. She specifically conquered all of Asia except India. Ninus, who was her husband, was his deified his father as Bel. So Ninus actually deified his father as Bel, and she participated in that deification. And then Bel is the sun god, and later is translated into Saturn by the Greeks. And then Bel is also translated into Priapus by the Romans. Sorry about that. And Priapus, if I remember right, is a fire god. However, he also cites Suidas from 950, who wrote in 950, roughly, who gives a little more details. This was the Middle Ages, and he says that Nimrod married Semiramis, who was his daughter, or granddaughter. And Nimrod was Saturn. And their son, who later turned out to be Jupiter, ran Nimrod out into Italy. And then he settled there, and Ninus ran Jupiter out. So Jupiter reigned for a little bit, and then Ninus was mad at him, and so he ran Jupiter out. And Jupiter then goes into Italy as well, and Nimrod, once he dies, he gives the throne in Italy to Jupiter. And then Ninus marries his mother, Semiramis. And eventually these all became certain pagan gods through evolution. That's Raleigh's theory and Suida's theory. But, of course, what connects these two, because there's a bit of a leap between she was a conqueror in some of the histories to all of these other things, that she was like incestuous, marrying your father, also marrying your son, holding on to all this power and that sort of stuff. Like that's a little bit of a leap there. And so we do have the Middle Ages where she actually began her evolution, and we saw this from Suidas. Her evolution went from just some conqueror or an unremarkable woman to basically the archetype of evil in women. And we see this beginning to take place in Suidas, but then Dante takes this up and speaks of her lust, making licit any sexual act she desires. So he talks about how if she wants to have sex with multiple men and is illegal, she just says, "I'm the queen, it's legal now." And that she wants to have sex with her son, "I'm the queen, it's legal now." And he wrote in 1320. Then Boccacius speaks of her great works. So he writes a work called De Claris Mulieribus. And in the second article there, he talks about Semiramis and says that she had a lot of great works. She was a conqueror. She conquered almost all of Asia except for India, but she had insatiable lust, and this overshadowed all of her great works. And, well, I wrote this wrong, but he is one of the earliest to accuse her of incest. Then you have Chaucer, who uses her as the archetypal wicked woman in his poem, The Man of Law's Tale. And basically at this point, it's just like if you call someone the next coming of Semiramis, which is what Chaucer does to this Muslim woman, then what you mean is she's just a murderer, wicked, kills a bunch of people, all that sort of stuff. The transformation is similar to Vlad the Impaler. At one point, Vlad the Impaler, he was just some king in the Visigoth Empire. And he was attacked by some Muslims, and he was like, I know how to deter them from attacking again. I'm going to take 20,000 of their troops that I've killed or took prisoner and just impale them on a stake. Then the Muslims come over, they see this, and they have superior forces, but they are so freaked out that they just leave. Over the course of the centuries, Vlad becomes Dracula. And so he becomes a blood-drinking vampire. And you say, okay, well, how did that transformation take place? Well, because people have imagination. And Semiramis had a similar transformation in her early years down to through the Christian eras. So, what do we know about the actual Semiramis that lived? Because according to Eusebius, she lived like 3,000 years or 2,000 years. There's a wide range there before he lived. And so what do we know about her? So we have the king's lists. First thing we're going to look at is, where is she? Well, the Assyrian king's list, which was written around 1049 through 722, it has her...
Just a sec.
Hello.
Okay, I found this on the web, for which was written rounds are 1049 through 700.
Stop it. Okay. The Assyrian king list has... I said Assyrian, that's why. Has...
Okay.
No! The Assyrian king's list has Semiramis named Samu Rama, and this is what most scholars associate with Semiramis. It has her reigning between 811 to 805 BC. Now that's a bit of a problem because that's way after Moses would have written Genesis. She was the wife of Shalmaneser III. She was the mother of Shamshi-Adad V and Adad-Nirari III. And she had an unremarkable reign, like 5 or 6 years. That's not a remarkable reign. It's definitely not the 42 years that some of the later Greeks claim that she reigned at. So what happens is Adad-Nirari usurps the throne. So her Shalmaneser III is like on his deathbed, and Adad-Nirari takes it and just pushes him out. And this is not seen very well by Shamshi-Adad V, so what he does is he leads a rebellion against Adad-Nirari III with the help of his mother, and he usurps the throne from him. And then, of course, he's a little too young to actually reign, so Samu Ramat acts as like a viceroy for a little bit until he grows up. But he doesn't kill Adad-Nirari III. What he does is he sends him into exile, but allows him to return upon his own death, where Adad-Nirari III actually reigns after his brother. And so you can sort of see how some people could get the idea that Semiramis' son pushed the Nimrod, because they were assuming that Nimrod was the husband of Semiramis, into some other place. And let's just assume it's Italy, and let's try to explain the origin of Saturn in this way. And then, of course, Shamshi-Adad V pushes this sun out, and then this sun becomes Jupiter. And so you kind of see the origin of how that myth begins. It's kind of actually original. But that is a problem if Samarama is in the 9th century BC, because that's way too late. So let's check the other king's list. Sumerian king's list. Now, we don't learn anything about Semiramis, but what we do get is the origin of Dumuzi. And if you don't know, Dumuzi is Tammuz. So this is important because of what Hislop wrote about Tammuz, and how the origin of Tammuz was in this Nimrod, Semiramis, Tammuz tripartite myth that's not attested to in the histories. First of all, this is one of the earliest kings lists. They start recording it in the 3rd millennium, so like 2900 BC. And they stop recording it in the 19th century BC. Which means a lot of these names are going to be contemporary. It is It is the chronicler after the king that writes about his reign that we get these lists from. Tammuz, is said to be pre-flood. So that what that tells us is when this king's list was getting written, Tammuz was actually a long-standing tradition at this point. So 2900 BC, Tammuz is already being worshipped, and it is like for a long time. They assume that it's been centuries, or maybe original to their faith, Tammuz has been worshipped. We do have this one woman in 2300 called Kugbal, which merely means tavern maid. And she made firm foundations of Kish. Maybe she was like a precursor to Semiramis. Maybe she was Semiramis because we don't actually know her name. But that's like all the information we have about her. We don't have any other information about Kugbal. So it's kind of grasping at straws on that one. What about Ninurta? Now, we talked a little bit about Ninurta, who a little while ago. There have been a few different Ninurtas. Ninurta was an 18th century, around 1800s king, and some people associate him with Nimrod, but we don't have a whole lot of information about him. Again. But one of the biggest things we learned from this list is that the gods that Hislop talks about, we have their names throughout the king's list, like from the earliest times down to like the latest times, down to the 19th century. You have Ninurta, you have Tammuz, you have Ishtar, you have all of the relevant figures. And
but from your reading of Hislop, it's sort of more. From your reading of Hislop, he's basically claiming that they're all in this neat little pattern, but from your reading of the King's List, they're scattered throughout time.
Yeah, that pattern doesn't reveal itself in the King's List.
Mm-hmm.
We have Dumuzi is way too early, and Ishtar is way too early in order for them to be associated with Nimrod or Semiramis.
When did we get most of these King's Lists?
So, like I said, the Sumerian King's List that we have extant today is from 2100 to 1800 BC.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would be the earliest version that we have. But they are assumed by scholars to be older than that.
No, but when has scholarship had them since?
Basically since Alexander Hislop. Okay. But they didn't have all of them, and they weren't all translated. So, let's see. Alexander Hislop was writing like right at the moment when they started finding these and started translating these. And one of the things in his book that he talks about is how he has read some of them, and and they attest to what he's talking about, but they don't. And that's what we have learned. So let's go to the Babylonian King's List, because this is actually a relevant person, or a relevant King's List, but there's nothing to be attested to Nimrod, Semiramis, or any of them.
We just know that
it
existed and we don't have it.
Exactly. Well, we have the Babylonian King's List.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't attest to them. It doesn't give us any good information about them, and they're just not there. Okay. The Egyptian King's List, we learn a few different things. First, Jer, who was a pharaoh in around 3100, was the first pharaoh to have Horus in his name. He was the defender of Horus. And we get the names Horus and Seth, the gods, as part of pharaonic names before the 26th century, which also predates even the historical Nimrod that we would have. And it predates Semiramis. And so what we learn is the Horus and Seth, that whole myth, far predates anything that has to do with Semiramis. And so it's the same issue with the Assyrian King's List. The names just are too old in order for them to account for, or to be accounted for by the Hislopian myth. Then what about the Hittite kings list? Again, we don't get anything relevant, but that's to be expected because they lived for like 500 years. Okay, so what do we learn about Semiramis? Is most scholars assume that she is Samuramat in around 811 to 805 BC. She cannot be the same one that she cannot be the wife of Nimrod. Because even if you're just a biblical, like you believe everything that the Bible says, Nimrod lived at the time of Abraham, and Abraham did not live in 800 BC. He lived way earlier than that. So, next thing that we can talk about is, what about the divine origin of Nimrod? Or this entire story. One of the things that is important to recognize is this whole Nimrod, Semiramis, all that, does not account for the actual history of religion and how these religions, the pagan religions in the ancient Near East, influenced each other. So the Sumerian religion, which we learned a little bit about in the Sumerian kings list, and the Egyptian religions actually developed independently of each other at first. And then you have, after them, the Sumerian religion basically became the Assyrian and Babylonian religions. And the Egyptians had some dealings with the Babylonians and the Assyrians. Not a whole lot, but they did have some influence on them, and there was influence going both ways there. The Babylonians and Egyptians influenced Canaanite religion because basically Canaan was right in between them. They were like the center point, or not entirely center point, but they were right in the middle. And so you had these faiths coming together and sort of mingling to become Canaanite religion. But more than that, in the 18th century BC, you had the Greeks coming over and bringing their religion, which they developed independently originally, but then they met up with the Egyptians, started trying to conquer them, and then they were pushed out by the Egyptians. So these Greeks moved over to Canaan. And of course, Greek is an anachronism because they were Aegeans, but their religion developed into Greek religion. But it also demonstrates that the Greeks, being a seafaring people at the time, had interactions with Egyptians and with Canaan, and there was a bilateral influence on their religions. So the Greeks were influenced by the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were influenced by the Greeks were influenced by the Canaanites, and the Canaanites were influenced by the Greeks. And we actually do assume that the Zeus, Aphrodite, and Hades gods were heavily influenced by the Canaanites. So let's talk a little bit about these each. There's going to be a lot of information on each of these slides, but we're not going to go into all of it. So, Sumerian religion. If you want to look more into this, then you can pause this video if you want. Sumerian religion basically has two ages. There's more than that, but I'm simplifying this heavily. So, Sumerian religion, earliest attestations we have are 2900 BC, roughly, and then in 2200 BC, you have this Akkadian conquest, and we talk a little bit about this with Sargon of Akkad, who came in and basically conquered everyone and started distributing this a slightly more hierarchical structure. But originally, the Sumerian religion was broken up into two levels on their hierarchy. You have the nature gods and the city deities. And the nature gods were Namu, An, Enlil, Ninhursag, and Enki. And then all of the city deities included Inanna, who was a patroness of Sumer before 3100 BC. Now, Inanna became Ishtar. That's just like one-to-one correlation. Inanna became Ishtar. After the Akkadian conquest, it became much more of a feudal pantheon. It became highly hierarchical. You had Enlil and Ninlil, his wife, at the top. They were the god of wind and storm. He was a king and god of wind and storm. They had Ninurta. He was like right below that. And this is one of the gods that most scholars try to associate with Nimrod. when you talk about the demythification of the gods in the Genesis story. A lot of them assume that Ninurta is one of these gods that were demythified in Nimrod, because he was the agricultural, the war, the storm, the healing, and the hunting god. So it makes a lot of sense that the hunting god would have been a great hunter before the Lord, and the war god would have basically started the first war and conquered a bunch of areas and built his kingdom. If there was a war god and a hunting god and there was a human origin, probably that would have been Nimrod. Enki and Ninhursag were under Ninurta and his wife. Then Inanna, the prostitution god, and Dumuzi was her husband, and Dumuzi is Tammuz. Dumuzi was a shepherd god. And Inanna became much more popular post-Akkadian conquest. So originally she was just a city deity. Afterwards she became much more ubiquitous. And as the centuries went by, she increased in her rank and her popularity. Eventually she became the most popular goddess. Not just in Akkad, not just in Sumer, not just in Babylon, but everywhere. And the reason is because all of those nations were generally governed by men, and she was a prostitution goddess, so makes sense. She influenced the Ugaritic Astarte, who Astarte was a Canaanite goddess, and then Astarte may have influenced the Greek Aphrodite, but we're not entirely sure there. Shamash was the brother of Inanna, and he was the sun god, the god of justice. Now, there's an issue here. Inanna does not marry Nimrod. Ninurta and Inanna do not marry in this myth. Inanna marries Dumuzi. Dumuzi is not her son or her father. Dumuzi is down here. We don't know exactly. Well, we do know who his father is, but he's not related to Inanna. Shamash, the sun god that a lot of people associate Nimrod with Saturn, is the brother of Inanna and never marries her. Doesn't have any sort of relations with her. He's just the brother. And one of the issues with the Dumuzi cycle, and this goes into what Hislop was talking about, how Tammuz died and rose again around the time of the winter equinox, because that's when the sun is the weakest, because we assumed that Tammuz was a sun god, but he wasn't. He was a shepherd god. The Dumuzi cycle was in the spring and fall, not in summer and winter. And that's going to be a common theme that you see throughout these religions. Summer and winter don't have much of a place in these early religions. The important the important festivals that they kept were in the spring and fall. And then there are a bunch of other gods under them, but we won't get into that. Next, we get to Egyptian gods, which developed independently of the Sumerian gods and later had some sort of dealings with them. Now, Egyptian religion was very complex, depending on what era you're studying it. But there were a few through lines, and you have the Seth Horus myth, which it did have its developments and its evolutions, but it had somewhat of a stable existence throughout Egyptian history. So the way that Egyptian religion works, being somewhat different from the Sumerian religions, is it worked in concentric cycles. And the broadest of those cycles, which had the most control out of most of the things, was the Ma'at versus Isfet cycle. And Ma'at was a god of truth, justice, beauty, order, goodness. That was Ma'at. And Isfet was the opposite. Chaos, ugliness, destruction, all of that. And so, just have a chaos order cycle. That's the broadest, the furthest concentric circle. That's in the Egyptian myth. Then you have the nature cycles. You have Ra, who is the sun, goes up and down. That's the Ra cycle. Isis is a mother god, very much has to do with a little bit of fertility, but not a whole lot. But it has to do with the cycle of childbirth and stuff. Horus, patron god of the king, had to do with the kingly cycle. among other things. This, again, is hyper simplified. But then you have Seth versus Horus. Now, this was a very early development in Egyptian history because you had two patron deities of kings of different regions in Egypt. You had Lower Egypt, which was in the north, and you had Upper Egypt, which was in the south. And there are a variety of reasons why they were called that, but basically, Lower Egypt, their patron deity was Seth. Upper Egypt, their patron deity was Horus. And the reason that Seth is oftentimes spoken of, like the imagery of Seth is very much like demonic imagery in Egyptian hieroglyphics and stuff, and culture, is because Upper Egypt conquered Lower Egypt. Like, that's the only reason. And then the myth around Horus and Seth developed as through this war, and that's what we assume. So the Horus and Seth myth goes something like this. Seth is the brother of Osiris, and Seth kills Osiris because he wants to be king. Then Isis, who is the wife of Osiris and the sister of Osiris, so Seth cuts Osiris up into 12 pieces and scatters him throughout Egypt, and each one of these pieces becomes a city. Isis digs up these pieces and finds them and puts them all together, but she is missing one piece, and that's his phallus. And what she does is she uses magic in order to reconstruct this mechanical phallus of some sort, so that a magical one, so that she can sleep with him and have a son by him. But then he just dies. He doesn't get resurrected in any way. She brings back his body, but then he goes to the underworld.
What do you think? Just to interrupt really quick, what do you think the implications of nations around the world having obelisks is? As far as, do you think it's irrelevant that they have obelisks, or is
I don't know enough about the history for that.
Okay. How do you feel about the Catholic Church having an obelisk at the Vatican?
I don't know enough of the history about to have an opinion on that.
Uh-huh. But it's uniquely an Egyptian symbol, right?
I believe it originated in Egypt, yeah.
Oh, okay. So, sounds good.
Yeah. I think it would just depend on what the obelisk actually stands for. We assumed that it stood for the penis of Osiris.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I don't know how that developed throughout the centuries. And so something can have one origin but have a centuries or millennia length development from that origin to meaning something entirely different. And we see that a lot in, like I talked about, Semiramis, and how she developed, and how Vlad the Impaler developed from a good Christian king to Dracula,
Mm-hmm.
So things can have a chasm of a difference between when it developed and when it was used by the Christians.
Okay. So could you give a biblical example of something that sort of morphed in its meaning throughout the centuries that we use today and we consider wholly biblical?
We use today?
Let's even say the Israelites, when they were obedient to God, would have been using.
We can see how the Bible brings it up and then how it evolves in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So it originated in the Bible and then it changed into something else in the Bible.
Yeah.
Well, you do have
or like you say, with the myth about Osiris and the obelisk, it could have some different meaning. It could have been founded with some different meaning, but now the meaning sort of that we know about is the myth about Isis and Osiris. So something like that in the Bible, to where what we know now about it is good.
I would say Nimrod.
Mm-hmm.
It's less people in the Bible talked about Nimrod afterwards, but Nimrod, when you read the original story in the Masoretic text, is kind of ambiguous. You don't know if he's good or if he's bad.
Mm-hmm.
But, and there are a lot of people who wrote before the 1st century AD who decided that he was actually good. One of the Targums, for instance, talks about Nimrod as being a righteous king, and that's why God gave him. Like, he was kind of wicked, but then he repented and became righteous.
Mm-hmm.
That's why God gave him all of his success. But you have Philo of Alexandria, and you have a lot of Agadic texts. You have like later Jewish version of Nimrod that turned him into the rebel, the quintessential, the archetypal rebel against God, and anybody who rebels against God is basically reenacting Nimrod.
So I was just thinking, because in the Vatican there's the obelisk in the center of that sundial. So is it possible that there was just a practical purpose for them and they just morphed into that?
Oh yeah,
but
definitely.
we'd have to just...
We do see that happening in history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So initially, just what I'm reading, it's sort of used for a sundial, but I'd now that I'm thinking about that, I'd want to look more into that.
Yeah, we should look more into that.
Yeah.
So, you have Isis. She sleeps with this quasi-resurrected Osiris, and then she has Horus, and then Horus defeats Seth, and then Horus becomes the patron deity of the kings. And then Osiris remains dead. He actually becomes the... Whoops. Sneak peek. He actually becomes the king of the underworld, and he becomes the judge of the underworld. So if anybody wants to get into the next life in order to be resurrected in any positive way, then Osiris would be the judge, and he's the one who weighs your heart. And what you see in this picture, you see Osiris. He is the king of the underworld. He's green because he's dead, and he has his wife Isis behind him, and he is judging the conflict between Horus and Seth. And then I don't know who this is. I think he's a priest. But that's the general idea. And then one of the most important aspects of the Egyptian religion that remained consistent was the idea of Ma'at, which is goodness, which the Greeks, when Egypt became more Hellenized, the Greeks syncretized with the idea of Ma'at, and this idea bled into, like, Alexandria.
I think you meant to say nomos, which...
Yeah.
You didn't mention nomos.
Nomos? I didn't?
No.
I thought I did.
You said Ma'at, which is goodness, which when the Greeks Hellenized Egypt,
yeah,
they
the Greeks syncretized with Ma'at, and they combined Ma'at with their nomos. And nomos is not just law. We typically translate it as law, but it means more like the universal practices of this culture, which oftentimes is in law. But
which the Greeks would call pious or impious, because they would call the Christians impious because they didn't worship the Greek gods or the Roman gods.
Yeah, exactly.
And, yeah.
But that bled into Alexandria, and it bled into a lot of the educational centers of the Roman Empire. And so Ma'at in ancient Egypt and Nomos, having been syncretized, does bleed into like Hellenized Judaism, for instance, and Christianity. So that might be one area that we can explore further.
Before you move on, are you able to sort of explain a little better the what you meant by the cycles of Egyptian religion, like with Ma'at and Isfet? What do you mean that they're concentric circles?
So the broadest concentric circle is Ma'at and Isfet, and that controls all of the circles underneath, or the cycles underneath. And
so how would that apply to like an Egyptian, or maybe it would just apply to an Egyptian priest
it would apply to every Egyptian, because Ma'at and Isfet they have to do with every like action that you perform.
So you're either being an agent of Ma'at or an agent of Isfet.
Yeah, okay. and so that's the thing that is the through line between all of the concentric circles. Like, you can't control the sun. You can do a spell to try to have Ra do one thing or the other, or Osiris, or a demon, or whatever. But the most basic thing, and the reason that you will get into the next life, and Egyptian religion was very much a death cult. Everything was surrounded around what you did when you died. Whether or not you get into the next life is based on how well you did Ma'at more than Isfet.
And then would that move on? What was the next concentric circle within that? Was that Ra versus?
Yeah, those would be the nature cycles, like the Ra cycle, like Apep, like those sorts
What
of
was
people.
was the opposite of Ra Apep?
Apep would be the opposite of Ra.
So within the people who followed Ma'at, or goodness, or order, there would be people who leaned more towards Apep or Ra, and so it's like you're either good or bad, and then once you're in the circle because you're good, you're either Ra or Apep, and then once you're within that circle,
I don't think you would associate yourself with Ra or Apep in those days. I think that was more like they were also good or Ma'at people or Isfet people or deities, because they were the nature deities and you were part of nature, but the more important thing was to be Ma'at more than Isfet.
And to be Ra more than Apep.
No, you didn't really be
No.
Ra. That wasn't a thing that you were.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, and then of course you had the mother and father gods, which had more to do with your personal life, and then the kingly gods. So the familial gods and the, let's say, livestock gods, or the ones that had to do with weather, or the ones that had to do with kingship, those you had a bit more to do with your daily life. But if I remember right, Ra didn't have to do too much with your daily life. Okay, let's move forward. So next we're going to talk about the Canaanite religion, which was influenced by Egyptian religion and Babylonian religion. Now, the Canaanite religion came a little bit later, at least in its development as it relates to the Bible. And in the Canaanite religion, you had, like, we don't know a whole lot about it, but we do know that they had a 4-tiered hierarchy. The first of the hierarchy had to do with the king and queen gods of creation. They were the father and mother of all the gods, and they were El and Asherah. Now, before you assume that Asherah was Ishtar, there's an issue with that, because underneath them you had the gods and goddesses that were born from El and Asherah, and you had Dagon, you had Baal Hadad, you had Yam, you had Mot, and you had Astarte. So we talked about before how Ishtar became Astarte. She didn't become Asherah. Asherah is a separate deity. Asherah is an entirely different deity. In the Canaanite religion, Astarte was a lower level deity. Now, she might have been worshipped more or less, but that's not the point. Because Ishtar, if you're just going with the religious genealogy, Ishtar was not, or Ishtar did not become Asherah. They're different. Now, Dagon was the early god of crops and fertility. Dagon and Baal Hadad were actually two of the earliest gods, as well as Asherah. El later became the king god. We're not sure when. So Dagon was the early god of crops and fertility. Baal Hadad was the king god of air and storm. Yam was the sea and river god. Mot was the god of death. And Astarte was the goddess of war, hunting, and love. Or, sex. Etc. There are a bunch of other gods. Then below them you had workmanship gods, and below them you had messenger gods. Now, the important part about the Canaanite religion that we assume, or that Hislop assumed was connected to the Semiramis and the Nimrod story, is the Baal cycle. The issue here, well, let's go over the Baal cycle a little bit. So Baal kills Yam and becomes the ruler of the gods underneath El. El is like the king, and Baal is like the king underneath him. Then Baal has a palace built for him, commissioned by El, and then Baal challenges Mot. But Mot is more powerful than Baal, so he cowers before Mot. And Mot swallows Baal. And then Anat, another god, not really related to this story, but not really related to the Nimrod story, goes to the underworld, kills Mot, grinds him up into powder, and then scatters him over all the world. So Baal is allowed to return to the land of the living, and rain returns. So Baal is the god of air and storm, and he controls when rain falls. And then after Mot recovers from being ground into powder and scattered throughout all the earth, the cycle continues. Now, this was typically seen as explaining summer droughts, or droughts in general, untimely droughts, which means that the Baal cycle was observed in spring and fall again.
Wait, so why are you going to mention later why Mot is mentioned in the Bible, or why do you think
Mot is mentioned in the Bible too?
It's just the word. It's
the Hebrew.
It's the Strong's H4194 is the word for Mot.
Yeah. It's pronounced Mavet in Hebrew, but
the root is Mot.
The root is Mavet, but the letters used would be the same letters in the Ugaritic for Mot, because it's Mem, Vav, and Tav. And so you could pronounce it either way. In fact, actually, from that, it just is pronounced Moot.
Mm-hmm.
And so death is Moot or Mavet or Tamut or any variety of how you would alter that word depending on its usage. And in one episode in Isaiah 28, I believe, God says to the people that you have made a covenant with death. The word there is Mot. You have made a covenant with Mot. Now these people, thinking that Mot was greater than Baal, and they associate Baal with Hashem, they think that Mot will win in the end. And God says, nope, that's wrong. You're not going to win. I'm going to annul your covenant with Mot because I'm greater. I have higher authority than him. And so the story goes. It's just really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on. Let's go to Babylonian religion very quickly. Basically Sumerian religion, except they have like post-Akkadian Sumerian religion, except they see Enlil as being replaced as the king god by Marduk, who was the more city-state god of Babylonia. Now, again, what you see is Shamash, who is the son, who is the brother of Ishtar, is, again, not associated with Ishtar at all here. In fact, where is Ishtar? I can't find her. Sin would be the god of the hunt. Sin would be the god of what's it called? Shepherding. And so that would actually be Tammuz there. But again, not associated with Ishtar. Actually, Ishtar is... I think Ishtar does marry Sin, but so then you have again that marriage of Sin and Ishtar, and you have a bit more detail added. Moving forward, then you have the Assyrian religion, is basically Babylonian religion, except they replace Marduk with Ashur, and Marduk is just some other god. They still celebrate Marduk as a god. I don't think Babylonia celebrated Ashur as a god, but Ashur, they're like, that's your god. We'll celebrate it, but not much. And then you have Greco-Roman religion, and again, the idea is that Hades, Poseidon, and Aphrodite might have been influenced by the Canaanite Baal, Astarte, and Hades. Or sorry, Baal. Baal, Hades, Yam, and Astarte, or Baal, Mot, Yam, and Astarte, and that would mean that Astarte is not, or Aphrodite is not associated with Asherah. Aphrodite would be associated with Astarte. So again, you have that difference there. Moving forward. India. Doesn't matter. Okay, moving forward.
It's so sorry, I'm just trying to backtrack. Ishtar and Asherah not related.
They're related in that Asherah is the mother of Ishtar.
Uh-huh. But Ishtar comes, you're saying Asherah or Ishtar comes more from Inanna?
Inanna became Astarte.
And
sorry. Inanna is Ishtar, who became Astarte in the Canaanite
and possibly
rendition.
Aphrodite, but not
and
Asherah.
Then possibly Aphrodite. Asherah did not become Aphrodite.
Uh-huh.
Asherah might have become Hera, maybe, because that sort of makes sense. Yeah, Asherah. Yeah,
But where did Asherah come from?
Asherah.
Yeah.
She would have just been the mother goddess.
Oh,
So
okay.
Ninlil, maybe, because
Mhm.
Ninlil became the mother of the other gods in the Sumerian religion. So as you see, the religions of the ancient Near East developed together, so they had some similarities, but they were different. Like the Egyptian religion was very different from the Sumerian religion. They had maybe a couple similarities, but the philosophy around them was different. And the Sumerian religion developed into all these other religions in Mesopotamia. And then the Greco-Roman religion developed it developed on its own originally, but then it had a little bit of communication with the Canaanite and the Egyptian religions. So you do have a little bit of association with them, but it is not the type of association that Alexander Hislop supposes, and that a lot of the people that say that Christmas is directly related to any sort of pagan religion, that association just doesn't exist in the history. But now we're going to actually get into the meat of this. All that was preliminary, basically.
Yeah.
And the reason is because, these preliminary, I guess, the preliminary information here regarding these pagan cultures is, if you're going to say that Christmas is from the pagan cultures, then you need to know something about the pagan cultures. Just a little bit. And a lot of the time when somebody makes these claims, they do like 5 minutes of digging, and they find 100 articles written by other people who did 5 minutes of digging into Christmas, and then they say that that's good enough. But then when you do 10 minutes of digging, you begin seeing that a lot of these claims just don't work. And that's the point that I'm getting across here. Now, how did Christmas come about? Moving forward to the 1st century, to the 2nd, to the 4th century, there are basically two theories about how it came about. One is the theory that Alexander Hislop sort of originated, and that is the religious history theory. And it actually was popular for about a century. And then the other theory is the chronology theory. So first, we're going to overview the religious history theory. Again, you had Alexander Hislop. He was sort of the originator. It was popularized by this guy named Usener. I forgot his first name, but he popularized it in 1905 and made it slightly more plausible. And then it remained kind of ubiquitous. Like, it was just assumed until 1999, when scholars really started to question it and to put the feet of the theory to the fire. And so the other theory, which actually predates the religious history theory, is called the chronology theory. It predates it because this actually was what was going on in the first few centuries of Christianity, and this is the theory that is the modern competitor of the religious history theory. And it is the chronology theory, and it's the idea that Christians didn't really care about Jesus' birthday for religious reasons. They cared about it for chronological reasons. They were trying to produce a history of the world, and so therefore they needed to know when Jesus was born so that they could add him to the chronology of the history of the world. It was more of a subsidiary point. They weren't planning on worshiping him on Christmas or on his birthday, because birthdays originally were a pagan thing. All birthdays were pagan, and Christians hated the idea of being pagan. So they ran away from any sort of semblance or image of looking pagan. So they didn't celebrate birthdays. They were like Jehovah's Witnesses. So,
can I read this quote really quickly from Origen?
Yeah.
On birthdays. And on birthdays, when the lawless word reigns over them, they dance so that their movement please the word. Someone before us has observed that it is written in Genesis about the birthday of Pharaoh, and has said that the worthless man who loves things connected to his birth with birth keeps birthday festivals, and I, taking the suggestion from him, find nowhere in Scripture that a birthday was kept by a righteous man. For Herod was more unjust than that famous Pharaoh, for the latter killed the chief baker on his birthday feast, but the former killed John. And that was Origen, circa 245. Not sure which writing it is, but it is interesting that it does seem that in Scripture you don't really get an example of Moses or Abraham celebrating their birthday. I think that's interesting because he's talking about people celebrating their own birthdays, whereas when we're talking about Christmas, we're talking about the advent of the light of the world coming into the world. So I think it's a slightly different thing. Where he's talking about self-gratification, we're talking about gratification of God, thanks to God, and gratification of the Savior.
Yeah, definitely. So there is a bit of a difference there, but they also steered clear from birthdays in general.
Yeah.
And so that was the early church. That was the first couple hundred years. So what they did when they were coming up with their chronologies is they came up with a few different theories about when they thought Christ was born or conceived. And some of them were in March, September, April, and December. In the first 300 years of Christianity, those were like the months that they had set Jesus's birth. So, and then we have the first actually set date was January 6th for the Epiphany. And then the first time that December 25th was was set as Jesus' birth was in 354. That's when it was set. Now that's interesting because December 25th was conjectured as Jesus' birthday earlier than that. And one example is Sextus Julius Africanus, who talked about December 25th as potentially Jesus' birthday. And he was writing in like 221. Now, 354 is also the first time that Sol Invictus, which was associated with Mithraism and Saturnalia and all of that, and Sol Invictus is what most scholars through the religious history theory assume became Christmas. So when you talk about Christmas is pagan and it came from the Roman Saturnalia or whatever, you're talking about Sol Invictus or Natalis Invictus becoming Christmas. But the issue with that is Natalis Invictus, the first time that it was ever described as happening on December 25th, was in also 354. So you have a bit of a chicken and egg problem because we don't know as historians which came first. Christmas on December 25th or Natalis Invictus on December 25th. Now you might say Christmas was celebrated way later than Natalis Invictus was celebrated, so how can that even be said? Well, we'll get into that in a second.
Can you explain for people who might not know what the Epiphany was?
No, not off the top of my head.
Okay. For me, it's been conflicted because it seems that people were celebrating the Nativity on January 6th, but also his baptism, and those. I'm not exactly sure about the Nativity, but baptism was, definitely viewed as an important thing. But either way, that was on January 6th, and that's when the Eastern Church still celebrates, one or both of those things.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, moving forward, let's go to the institutions of Natalis Invictus as a celebration. 20th century scholarship basically just assumed that Natalis Invictus happened on December 25th, and it was Aurelian in around 274 that instituted Natalis Invictus. Now, the way that this theory goes is it originated like 500 BC-ish as an Oriental celebration on because they deified the sun, and it didn't actually originate in the Greco-Roman area. But then it was brought into the Greco-Roman area by like the Greek conqueror, Alexander the Great, and then the people in the Greek world celebrated it a little bit. It was like a really big celebration, but they didn't celebrate it for very long because it actually went against the Greek ethos that philosophy was good and divine sun worship was actually not that good. So then it died down in like 300 BC, and it was just dead for a while. And then Aurelian just sort of brought it back up at around 270 AD. And he told all of the pagan world, all of the Roman Empire, to celebrate Natalis Invictus, and it's like the most important celebration of the year. Most wonderful time of the year, Natalis Invictus. And then for the next 70, 80 years, it was like the most riotous time because everybody celebrated Natalis Invictus and they all really liked it. And then Christianity decided to just make it Christmas.
But that's not
around
really,
350.
But that's not really accurate because I think there's also possibly an argument for the fact that the first sort of dating of Christ's birth, I believe, or sort of loose reference to that, was Clement of Alexandria in 200. And then after that, Sextus Julianus Africanus in 221. Mm-hmm. And then after that, it was Hippolytus of Rome was in 236. So mm-hmm. they all published books, and Sextus Julianus Africanus and Hippolytus of Rome were definitely more specifically mentioning Christ's birth dating as December 25th. Clement of Alexandria, I believe, dated his conception to Passover March 25th, mm-hmm. the Passover, and so 9 months would be December 25th.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so like a lot of times the conception, either the conception or the birth was like in the spring or the fall or something along those lines. But a lot of times when you take the chronology, just add 40 weeks or subtract 40 weeks, you end up in the winter or mm-hmm. something along those lines. And so like December is not a strange time for Jesus to be conceived or born in early Christianity. A lot, mm-hmm. like they kind of, depending on what they were focusing on, they kind of just assumed that December was important in some way. Mm-hmm. So, but going back to Natalis Invictus, contrary to the 20th century scholarship in this area, the sole festivals, the festivals for the sun, were celebrated regularly since the founding of Rome, like hundreds of years, and they were always celebrated. Like they never sort of dropped off and then just like popped up, like the idea that 20th century scholars believed with Aurelian. But the other really important thing is they were relatively unimportant festivals. They were like Veterans Day, maybe a little more, but they were like you take the day off because you can. And you maybe do one or two things, post a YouTube video thanking your veterans or whatever, but it's not the important festival. As we have seen in...
That may be controversial for some of my family members.
As we have seen in the other ancient pagan traditions, the more important festivals were the harvest festivals. The sun, that's important, but not as important. Harvest is really important, but we do see, as this unimportant festival was celebrated throughout the history of Rome, the date also changed. So the early version of the festival was August. It was celebrated August 8th, 9th, the 28th, and December 11th. And yeah, these were like minor little festivals. The main festival was October 19th through 22nd. So it was a fall festival. And then sometimes, and the agones, that means the chariot races that is referenced in the calendar in 354, and that's a lot of times what people will talk about with the riotous carnival of celebration. They're talking about the agones instituted by Aurelian, but he instituted the agones in 724, and he instituted them on October 19th through 22nd. It was October, not December. Sometimes there's one calendar found in 200 AD that associated Natalis Invictus on December 23rd, but again, this was before it was a major holiday. And then the first time that Natalis Invictus is celebrated on December 25th that we have any sort of written record of is in 354 on the same calendar that claims that Jesus' birthday was December 25th. And so the question that scholars today ask is, did Christmas get celebrated on December 25th, and then the pagans wanted to disrupt Christian practice because they hated them, and so they moved one of their festivals to December 25th? Or did Christians usurp a pagan festival? Chicken and egg problem there. But the main thing that scholarship generally agrees on today is that there's no evidence that the December 25th date of Natalis Invictus antedates Christmas on December 25th.
Can you explain what antedates means?
Comes before.
All right.
And then we have also this idea that Sol and Sol Invictus, which is the unconquered sun, are different. So this is another reason why the festivals were actually not that important, is because the festival for Sol does not necessarily mean that you have a festival for Sol Invictus. And we have evidence for that, archaeological evidence. We find in Jewish synagogues, Sol, that's right here in the middle there, is depicted in the center of their calendar, while the zodiac surrounds Sol, because this is a solar calendar, and then you have the four winds in each of these corners. Now this is a Jewish synagogue found in 300 AD. Or not found in 300 AD. It was found and dated to 300 AD. You have similar synagogues. They found it.
They found it in 300 AD. That was a quick turnaround. They built it, it got buried. They found it in 300 AD.
You have similar synagogues in the 5th and 6th centuries. We found 4 synagogues with this specific imagery on the floor for the calendar so people can keep track of whatever month they're in. That's important because we also find this in Christian symbolism. Like we have the sun ring, the sun disk around Jesus, and we have a variety of other soul imagery, and then we have sermons by Christians associating Christ as the sun, the morning star, so to speak. And the idea there is that, and what a lot of scholars are coming to the conclusion of, is that there's actually a bit of a difference between Sol and Sol Invictus. Sol is not necessarily the god. And if you anthropomorphize Sol, it's kind of basically like if you watch Teletubbies and the sun comes up with the face of that baby. That's basically what it is. Sol, if you anthropomorphize him, is not necessarily a god that you worship. It might just be the symbol of the sun. And so you have these synagogues and these churches that have the depictions of Sol as, like, let's say, sometimes David, sometimes as Christ, sometimes as other people. And it's because that they were comfortable with doing that because it wasn't a deity. Sol Invictus was, but Sol wasn't necessarily.
Do you think that's just indicative of the fact that there was less of an orthodoxy back then?
Potentially. But I think also, given the fact that they were trying to run as far away from paganism as they possibly could in the first few centuries, I think that it has more to do with the fact that it wasn't directly
seen
associated.
as something that's
it wasn't directly associated with the god.
With everybody.
Yeah,
just everybody does this.
It was associated with the sun, not the sun god.
So you don't. But wouldn't that sort of be kind of evidence of Hellenization at the very least?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay.
But there's nothing wrong with Hellenization if you Hellenize in the good way.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
What does that mean in the good way?
We'll get into that later. Okay. So there's evidence there that there's actually a dissociation in the early church and early rabbinic Judaism, a dissociation between the sun and the sun god, and they're able to exist simultaneously. So does Christmas originate as a sun god worship festival? There's not a lot of evidence for that. And there's plenty of evidence that Christians
hated associating with paganism, and so there's decent evidence that Christians would never have done that in the first place. Not to mention the 20th century theory that Aurelian just sort of brought up a dead festival, and then all of the pagan world just decided to wholeheartedly celebrate it as their main festival, and then so much to the point that the Christians had to usurp it, like just a couple decades later. Doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't get into the heart of how people actually work. So let's move forward to today. Syncretism. Is syncretism wrong? Now that's the question that we have to ask. So let's suppose that Christians did take a pagan festival and turn it into a Christian festival. You would assume that that's wrong. But there's a problem there. Because God uses pagan tropes and pagan things all the time in the Bible. Here's just a list of a few of the ones that I could find sources for. If I were to write a list and find the sources in like 15 to 20 minutes, this is a list that I would come up with. And I'm sure people have written like much longer lists. So first, God uses tropes from other myths in his creation stories. So you get the tropes of the destruction of Tiamat. You get the tropes of the destruction of the Tannin. You get a variety of other tropes. The tropes of you get the demythification of certain gods and goddesses in Genesis 1 through 6. You have Abraham, who met under the Ishtar tree. People don't realize, but the oak or the terebinth was the tree that Astarte would meet people under. And Abraham met God under it and performed sacrifices under it. At least built altars, and we presume also did sacrifices. God meets people on high mountains. This was ubiquitous in pagan society. If God was wanting to distance himself from paganism because pagans did it, he would not have met on high mountains. And he wouldn't have associated his name with any sort of mountains.
Did any pagans meet on low mountains?
Yeah, you had the Valley of Hidom.
Okay.
So I guess, he just had to choose.
He had to pick the best of the worst. The best of...
best of both worlds. Yeah.
The better of two evils God had to choose from.
Yeah, I guess so. Huh. More like his character. Okay, then you have Sargon's origin. Is his mother doesn't want him to be persecuted, so she puts him in a basket and sends him down a river, where he is later picked up by another person and raised by this other person.
What document was that in?
The myth of Sargon, of a god.
Okay.
And this is used in the Moses story. You have the Ark of the Covenant mimics not just the poles, but all the dimensions of the Egyptian sacred boxes that they would put sacred stuff in, and also sarcophagi and stuff like that. You have the tabernacle that God commands Moses to build is like 1-to-1 ratio to the ancient Canaanite temples, their tent temples. Then you have a lot of laws God just copies and pastes from the Code of Hammurabi. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is directly stated in the Code of Hammurabi hundreds of years earlier. Then you have the format of the covenants that God uses for the people of Israel are again copied and pasted from the Hittite covenants a couple hundred years earlier. You have God saying that he rides on the clouds, and that's also a trope that Baal uses for himself, and that's a trope that Zeus uses for himself. You have God calling himself El Elyon, which is also the title of the god El from Canaan. And you have Techelet, which was originally the main export of the Canaanites, that the Greeks, that's why Canaanites got their name, is because the Greeks associated the name Canaan with their word for Techelet, the mollusk that made the blue dye. And then we have Paul quoting a poem about Zeus, except replacing Zeus with God. And you have Jesus referencing Socrates in some of his ethical statements.
Is that for in him we live and move and have our being?
Yep. And then the Socratic quote, if you read Plato's Republic, Socrates says you need to do good not only to your friends but also to your enemies. And that doesn't originate, well, you could say that Jesus came up with it, but there's another thing too, is if you want to say that one religion came from another, you have to assume that, or you have to say that neither of them could have come up with that specific set of religious practices. But I won't talk about that. But the basic idea here is that God is not shy from using pagan things. What he hates is using evil pagan things. He uses pagan things all the time. But what he hates is using evil pagan things. So what do we do today? We should definitely seek holiness. Hang on, I'm going to move this.
What?
What? Seek holiness. If there's something, if you feel like your conscience is telling you not to do something because you think it's pagan, don't do it. Be holy. But more than that, well, not more than that. Additionally to that, seek unity. The Bible talks all the time, especially in the writings of Paul and Jesus, or the sayings of Jesus, that we need to be unified. And also, maintain traditions. There's nothing wrong with traditions.
I want to add something to the seek unity.
I have to use the bathroom.
Okay. So one of the histories, or in the church history by Eusebius, he recounts how in one of the synods during the time of Irenaeus was seeking to excommunicate the Eastern Church because the Eastern Church was basically celebrating Passover on the 14th of Nisan, keeping the traditions of Jews, which was just keeping the tradition that John had passed on to him. John was a Jew. And so Irenaeus was seeking to excommunicate them because they weren't going to keep the same tradition as the Western Church. I believe Irenaeus was the bishop of the church in Rome at that time. But when they had the synod, half of the Western bishops did not want to excommunicate the Eastern Church, citing that unity was more important. That Polycarp, the bishop of Asia, or one of the Eastern churches, had fellowshipped with the Western Church, even though he followed that tradition of keeping Passover on Nisan 14, like the tradition of John before him and the Jews before them. And so we see that even the difference of date and celebration was not a cause for disunity. With Christmas, there's that debate over whether or not it's pagan, but I think that Zeli's done a pretty good job at establishing why it is both it doesn't have a solid foundation, and also why there are more important things. And one of those arguments I haven't heard from Messianics is that keeping or celebrating Christ's birth is a bad thing. So I don't think that's really an argument that's happening today at all. But I have heard the argument that it's on the wrong day, and that's why we should disfellowship from them, or something of that nature. And I think that would be just about the worst thing. And we have evidence of that from very early, from the first and second generations of believers.
Mm-hmm. It is. I'm gonna move closer.
Oh, it says your screen sharing is paused.
No, stop sharing.
Oh, okay. This.
Oh, that's interesting. Wonder why. Resume share. I wonder how long that's been going on.
Oh no. Maybe the whole time.
Oh no.
We would have to do this again.
Oh no. Well, we will see. How? Man. Okay.
That's okay. We'll just assume that it's not, and that people haven't been watching a blank screen this whole time. And just our faces, as you can see.
Exactly.
Maybe they can just read the reflection in my glasses. The angled reflection.
Have you been seeing my screen?
No. It's been frozen.
Oh no. It's still paused. Resume sharing. Why is it still paused? Is it because it's recording?
I don't know. It worked last week, so let's just hope and pray.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway. Okay. It is a judgment on a people of God to divide them. We see this in the division of the northern and southern kingdoms, and it is the opposite of judgment. It's a blessing when God brings them together. We see that Paul, the entire book of Corinthians, is talking about divisions in the church and how it's a sin to divide. We see the psalm, how great and lovely it is, and Hine Matov Umanaim, how great and lovely it is when brothers dwell together. Unity is important to God. And as we have seen, because God does some pagan things, and he associates himself with pagan things, and like the apostles and Jesus are not afraid of using pagan things when they are not bad, when they're good. It's unity is more important than division from paganness. And again, we don't even know if the paganness was really part of the whole Christmas tradition. Now, of course, like Christmas developed into something that may be associated with paganism, but like, where does a tree come from? Where does a Yule log come from? Like, where do the specific things come from? But another thing is, if you have to look into history to find out that something is pagan, it's probably not pagan.
So I would just add that if even Passover was not seen by the first, second, third generations of Christians or followers of the way, as some might call them, then and Passover, Easter, which, by the way, the etymology of Easter is eoster, which by the majority consensus of scholars has absolutely nothing to do with Ishtar, comes from the Anglicanized version of to pass over. So it is just the same word. But if even Passover was not a source of excommunicating or disfellowshipping from the other church, it being on a different day,
and being a much more important celebration too.
Yeah, and the Western Church having it on a different day than the tradition that was kept by the church, and Polycarp was one who still, regardless of that, fellowshipped with the Western Church, and he's a biblical character. Mm-hmm. Then we have a strong foundation that an extra biblical holiday is especially not something to divide or disfellowship with our fellow believers over.
So another question is, if a holiday is not found in, if it does not originate with God's command, is it okay to keep?
Of course.
Yes, it is. Purim was a human edict. Hanukkah, Jesus kept, but it was invented in the intertestamental period. People can invent more celebrations. We invented Thanksgiving. We invented a bunch of national holidays. It's okay to celebrate things that humans invent. And if humans came up with the idea of Christmas, that's okay. You can celebrate it. It's worse to divide from our fellow brothers. And more than that, I see a lot of Messianics, they talk about Christmas and in a somewhat of an accusatory way. Like, if you're a Christian and you celebrate Christmas, you're celebrating paganism. And what I see is this idea comes from a sense of more pride than anything. There's no reason, we don't know. At best, we don't know. At worst, you're wrong. And so sticking to that, I think, is just pride. You're trying to make yourself better than your Christian brothers for absolutely no reason. And then beyond that, is Christmas an idol? Again, if I had come to a different conclusion and you're a Christian and you were like, well, I'm just going to celebrate it anyway, ask yourself if Christmas is more important than what God wants. And then again, if you don't like the conclusion I came up with, ask yourself, Is the holiday more important than what God wants? God wants us to be unified. And again, he wants us to maintain the traditions too. You see 1 Corinthians 11, Colossians 4, Matthew 24, Acts 23, Acts 21, Acts 28. Like, in a variety of places, Paul and Jesus talk about maintaining the culture. Don't rock the boat unless it's absolutely necessary. Is it absolutely necessary to dissociate from Christmas? No. If you have to look into history to find out something is pagan, first of all, it's probably not pagan. And second of all, historically, it's not pagan. It's just, the evidence isn't there.
So I just wanted to add Paul's, this is an interesting thing to discuss, but Paul's anguish over Israel in chapter 9 of Romans, verse 3. But I'll just read from the beginning. I speak the truth in Christ, I am not lying. My conscience confirms it through the Holy Spirit. I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. For I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my people, those of my own race, the people of Israel. So, like, to me, it sort of seems like Paul is saying that if he could basically be cast into eternal punishment or be cast away from Christ, whatever that theologically means, for the sake of all of his fellow countrymen, to be brought back to Christ, then he would. That's what it seems like he's saying. And so I just think that sort of indicates that our view on Christmas, even if some of the traditions are rooted in paganism, and we should, try and get away from those, we should still want more for our fellow countrymen, and especially our fellow Christians, to be brought to Christ in his fullness, to believe in the blessings of the Torah that God gave us for life and not for death. And we should use every avenue that we can to try and teach people that. And if we cut ourselves off from Christians by making Christmas a stumbling block for all of us against all of Christianity that celebrates Christmas, which is 93%, according to Pew Research, that of Christians that celebrate Christmas, then we are causing that division, and we don't have the same heart for our own people, not only our own countrymen, but also for fellow Christians. We don't have the same heart for them that Paul had for the Jews. So we need to have heart. we need to want people to see the Torah as a blessing, and if we cut off avenues to help teach people that, then that's going to be on us at judgment.
Yep, exactly. And with that, is there anything you wanted to talk about? Any last things?
That was the last things.
So next week, hopefully, we're going to have a debate. That will be fun. We're going to have a discussion between Michael and myself, and then two of my good friends and Michael's good friends, who are on the other side of this. They, from what I understand, they think that Christmas is pagan in general, in its origin and in its development, and it is wrong to celebrate Christmas because of that. And I haven't spoken to them about this topic for a while, so I don't know where they exactly are right now, but it'll be an interesting discussion, in my opinion.
I haven't talked to them since I also thought Christmas was entirely pagan and bereft of value.
Exactly. So, hang on, how do I...
Oh no, your face is gone.
Yay, we're bigger now. So with that... If you have any questions...
Christmas, pagan?
Is it pagan?
Wait, no, just move it over to where he's slapping his face. That is Santa Claus, by the way.
Oh, yeah, by the way.
We didn't even talk about Santa Claus.
Didn't.
St. Nicholas of Myra.
Yeah. That's Santa right there.
Basically, I'll close with this. The earliest sort of definitive evidence that there maybe was a guy was basically in
named
400...
Saint Nick.
Named Saint Nick. Jolly old Saint Nick. Saint Nicholas of Myra who was a bishop in Asia, is in 401, which he's supposedly lived and died in 374, was in 401, where one of the Christian emperors built a church in his name, basically.
And during the Council of Nicaea, Arius got up and started defending his position, and Saint Nick, he got so mad at Arius that he got up and smacked him.
And he slapped him just like that.
He's like,
over and over and over, repeatedly. Bop, 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 bop.
And so, yeah, next time you think about Santa, check in that list twice.
Think of him as a defender of Christ's divinity and not being a creation, rather than a fat, jolly old man just with a white beard who sees you when you're sleeping and knows when you're awake. He knows when you've been good or bad, so be good for goodness sake.
Otherwise, he'll slap you.
Otherwise, he'll slap you like he slapped Arius.
Okay. Have a good day, everybody. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or whatever, you know where to put them. Now, how do I stop this?
Amen. Stop sharing.
Stop sharing. Stop recording.
Okay. Oh, that went long. Okay.
It went for
2 hours.
Yeah, just about.